Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and today we're describing some of the different variations of coaches and really helping you understand the terminology used on the UK's coach fleet. Most of them have letter classifications that you may have seen both in model form and on real life railways too, but they can be quite confusing. Certainly knowing what each classification means and how it actually defines the coach that you have in front of you can be bewildering. But I've got a little bit of a guide here for you today on how to tell the different types of coach right from the early days of UK railways up to some of the most modern vehicles in use today. So I'll be covering some of the data and some of the info for you here. If you do have any questions, please do add them in the chat and I'll be answering them throughout the stream. But otherwise, let's get started. So coach classification systems, why are they needed? First of all, it's to make sure that the right vehicles are being put on the right service to allow the correct amount of first class seating, or to make sure there's a restaurant car on an express service. It's a quick code to train planners and shunters to know that they have got the correct vehicles in their train, and also to the teams to know the train formation, to know how many seats they have for certain different types. Maybe it's the different classes, such as first, second and third. And these were introduced right at the start of the railways, with initial railways such as the Stockton and Darlington and the Liverpool and Manchester operating a class system with different tickets and different levels of comfort. In these early days, names weren't really given to the types of coaches. You could tell very distinctly by the designs which was which. But as coach design evolved, a lot of the designs really started to look similar, so some differentiation was needed. By the time we arrive at the early 20th century, a lot of companies were building similar but quite different coaches, and these were then defined mainly by the couple of different factors that we see here. These were either defined by the name of the designer, such as a London, Brighton, South Coast Railway Stroudley coach, an element of the design, such as the top light coach that we see here for the Great Western Railway, with the top windows allowing the light to come in through the top. Or in some cases, the early standardization came in with some of the coaches on the London and North Western Railway, for the example, where they applied the length of the coach, so such as a London North Western Railway 50-foot coach. But there were so many different types, so many different diagrams. It did get quite confusing. A lot of the vehicles were referred to as diagrams too. There wasn't a huge amount of coach standardization in the pre-grouping era, and that brings us into the Big Four. Now, this was the grouping of the railway companies in 1923 into four major railway operators, and they did need an element of standardization, especially as all the smaller companies that they comprised of had been building their own coaches to their own designs for many, many years, and they needed to know whether it was a brake vehicle, whether it was first, second or third class, or indeed a composite coach, which incorporates different classes in the same vehicle. And the LMS and the LNER both started to experiment with standardization systems in the 1930s. The LMS looked at standardizing their names for the coaches and the standardized designs, with the period system coming into place, where you have period 1, 2 and 3 vehicles, dependent on when they were built for the LMS railway. Also on the LMS, you do have a callback to the pre-grouping era, where these are known as the Porthole Coaches. So again, a defining feature on these particular vehicles being the porthole style windows. The LNER started to invent a letter system so they could apply codes to the coaches, so they knew at a quick glance at the running stock list that they knew exactly what each type of coach was. And this system evolved under British Railways and applied to their new standard coaches. These were built to mainly replace a lot of the different designs from the Big Four railway companies after the nationalisation in 1948. These eventually became known as the Mark I coach, but were introduced as the standard coach, as you see here. And this is where the system really started to come into place with the letters. With this standardized body, as you'll see, not only the colour schemes were different, but the coaches did look quite similar across the different classes, with some minor variations in window location and interior layout. But otherwise, it got a lot harder to be able to define each type of vehicle from just a glance. So this coaching code system really was needed. And here is a version of the 1950s coach code system. So you've got all your different carriage classifications there, and you'll see that some have been reused over time as different items came in and out of service. So, for example, we look at T. With the start of British Railways, there was actually first, second and third class seating. This was kept up until the late 1950s when it was disbanded. In 1956, I believe, but it was retained on boat trains for a while, so you could have had a classified T coach. But this mainly became known as the tourist coaches, which were the open style coaches with 2x2 seating. So there's a lot of different codes there. Some of them define the actual layout of the vehicle. So whether it is a corridor vehicle with K or an open vehicle with O, whether you have a brake compartment or a buffet in there as a B, the classification of the passenger saloon, whether it's first class with F, C as composite, or indeed S as second too. So you can see already we've got a standardized system on the go. So let's have a look at some coaches and see how that standardized system implements. So starting with the first one we looked at, this is what's known as a BSK on the standard Mark I coaching stock fleet. So the B stands for brake, which we have on the right. It's got a full brake compartment, including a luggage space. The S stands for second class, so it's purely second class seating. And the K stands for compartments. And if you look over on the left of the coach, you'll see 4 windows with compartment seating behind them. So it is a compartment coach with a brake area, and it's purely a second class vehicle. Next up, we have a CK. Now, this is a composite, so there's actually first and second class seating that we see here. And that is denoted by the yellow stripe on the top of the coach, which came into force in the late 1960s to differentiate the difference between the first and second class in use. This was also on a lot of coaches with the number on the door. You can see the number 1 at the first class end of the saloon there. And this was in place right back towards the start of railways over a century earlier. So if you're not quite sure what class your coaches are, do have a look for the numbers on the doors, and they should give you some differentiation. Also there, the C is the composite, but the K is the compartments again. So it's a purely compartment coach. And there we have our CK. This also works for catering vehicles too, of the standard Mark I design. This is an RMB, so restaurant miniature buffet. If we refer back to our list, you'll start seeing that we have used some of these codes that have now come up on our screens. So that is the corridor coaches and the compartment coaches that do come through in that time. So this was the classification going into the 1950s, where a real standardized system was needed for the new British Rail standard coaching stock. With the differentiation on the inside, a lot easier to see on the outside. This is the interior of an SO, so this is a second open with 2B1 seating inside. This was kept up for the next generations of coaches too, but after the standard introduction of coaches, there was a new set of coaches designed to a broadly similar design. These were known as the Mark II coaches, with the original standard designs becoming known as the Mark Is. These then retain the similar coding system. So we have here an FO. This is a first open, so it's a fully first class coach with open plan seating. And you'll see again, you can tell that by looking on the side of the coach. It has the 1 on the doors for the first class, and then the yellow stripe on the top denoting the first class seating in there too. So this Mark I, Mark II Mark system was brought in the 1960s when the Mark II coaches were started to be constructed. This carried on throughout BR, with various other vehicles being built on top of that. So next we head into the Mark IIIs, and these again were purely air-conditioned vehicles. And this particular vehicle here is an SLEP, or a SLEP as it may be known. So that is a sleeper, SL, if we go back to our codes. And then an EVA class vehicle, so that can be converted from either standard class or first class areas for sleeping. And then the P on this vehicle actually stands for pantry. So it does have a pantry space on there. But in the 1980s, some of the letter changes did start to come through. Where we look at our list, there was a couple of minor changes. Second became standard towards the end of the 1980s with the abolition of the third class. So you either had first or standard class seating. T, instead of tourist or third, quickly became trailer coach, especially in the Mark IIIs that worked with the HSTs at the time. And then there was also the introduction of two further letters. You had W for wheelchair access and D for disabled access in some of the more modern vehicles too. So these systems were continuously updated and changed when the coaches needed different designs. So all of the vehicles by this time were pretty much open vehicles. Compartments in rolling stock had started to disappear. Some of the last Mark I corridor and compartment vehicles were in use into the early 2000s, but they had started to dissipate from the UK's railways at this point. A quick note to look at some of the Mark III vehicles that operated with HSTs. These were actually known as DMU trailers rather than fully loco-hauled coaches. So these had some of the separate classifications that we see. And it is worth a quick look at some of the DMU classifications, which follow a similar system, but do have some slight differentiation based on some of these vehicles being powered. So this is the multiple unit classification system that we can see here. Again, this has changed slightly over time, but all of these vehicles are designated as open trailers. So building up some of the Mark IIIs that worked with HSTs, we no longer have the open or compartment designation, but we do have TS, for example, which would be a trailer standard, which is your standard coach in a HST rake, and other designations such as TF, which would then be a trailer first. So you still had your loco hauled variations coming into your Mark IIIs, but some of these changed when it came through into the HST hauled units that went into DMU coding. So it is a little bit confusing to follow, but coming right up into the modern era, we have the Mark IV coaches, which follow a similar style. We gained the driving trailers at this point too. The purely non-passenger carrying coaches, which have a driving cab at one end. And these in some cases are known as DVTs. So they'll have a driving van trailer with space for luggage in there with the van designation. Or indeed, if we look at the recently introduced Mark V coaches, which are again a fully push-pull formation, this at the front is a DT vehicle, so a driving trailer. Again, we've lost the O or the K for the open or corridor designation, as these vehicles are now solely open coaches. So they are classed as standard loco haul coaches, including the Mark III A and B, the Mark IVs, and both the Mark Vs and the Mark V-As. So that Mark system has carried on through to designate the different types of coaches. So you can see from the introduction of the Mark I in the 1950s, right through to the Mark III in the 1970s, and on to the Mark IVs and Mark Vs that are in service today. That Mark system differentiates the major design changes in the types of coaches. So what's not included in this system? What haven't we covered today? This is only for passenger carrying stock or the driving vehicles that we mentioned. If we start looking towards the non-passenger carrying stock, we have a lot of postal vehicles, which will be designated with a P in the code, but there are many, many different types of those, and the letters are often unique to the actual vehicles themselves. So do check those out on an individual basis. Also, coaches converted for departmental and engineering use. A number of the Mark Is were converted, and these then gained completely different codes than the standard coaching stock system. They were actually counted under the freight stock system, which is something we may cover in another video. And finally, then you have vehicles such as the Stove Rs, which are the train heating vehicles, again with no passenger accommodation in there, so they don't count as part of this system. But otherwise, our system that we've covered, with some letter changes over the different dates and times, covers most of the coaches from the 1930s onwards. and gives you the different types there that you can differentiate. So how do you apply this to your models? How does this actually work? So if you have a copy of that list to hand, and I will be uploading it separately so you can keep it with you at all times if you wish, you can start looking at your coaches and adding some of those letters. So this modeling O gauge that I have here is a Mark 1 brake second corridor. So you've got the brake area, you've got the corridor compartments here, and it's a purely second class vehicle. So we there have a Mark 1 BSK. Here, this is a model of a Centenary Coach, a Great Western Centenary Coach. Coming back to the earlier part of this video, a lot of the Big Four and pre-grouping coaches were known by a certain name, and these were designated the Centenary vehicles because they were built and designed in the Great Western Railway centenary year in 1935. The Gresley Teaks are the defining coach of the London North Eastern Railway, and these again were designed by Gresley and have a teak finish, so they're known as the Gresley Teaks. And right at the end there we have one of our Mark IIs with the brake and the open area for second class, so that is a BSO, or brake second open. So I'll give you one last look at that classification system. And hopefully this has given you some indication onto how to understand some of your coaches, but also gives you the purpose for them in running in different formations in your layout too. We do have some formations guides on our website which designate the different types of coaches that you see on the railways. And hopefully now with the letter codes available for you, you can start to understand how some of those apply to the stock that you have in your collection. So, as said, I'll put the sheet up for you so you can have a look at that whenever you need it. It is something that's really useful to have when you're looking at coaches, and you can see the different designs there. And one last tip, look at some of the livery elements on the coach too, to give you some classification information. If we go back to our CK of the Mark 1 design, you can see there that we can tell this is a CK really, really easily. The C stands for composite, so it will have both first and second class seating. Now we can see that the first class area only covers part of the coach, with the designation of the yellow stripe and the number 1 on one end of the coach only, with the other end not indicated that it is first class seating. So that is composite seating. And then the K, of course, covers the corridor and the compartments that are inside the coach. So even if you're looking at the design of the vehicle, you can look at the livery that it's carrying and the specific places of yellow stripes and indications of first class interiors. And that will also give you some clues as to identifying your coaches too. But as ever, do check out the link in the description, because I will put that link in there for you and the table that I've shown you throughout today's video. But we do put full classifications for the vehicles on our website too. So when you are buying a coach, you will see that it doesn't only have its letter code, but also the type of coach that it is. For example, this will be referred to as both a BSK and a brake second corridor. So you can really find them quite easily when you're picking up a model from us too. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope this has helped solve a couple of mysteries or questions that you may have had regarding some of the coach models out there and just how they fit into different rakes. Do take a look at some more of the history out there. There's quite a bit we haven't covered, including postal stock and non-passenger carrying coaching stock too, but it's a broadly similar system to what we saw here today. Don't forget to like our YouTube channel and subscribe to it too, and like our Facebook page and check out the website for more great videos like this, including skills cast sessions, real railway profiles and model overviews. Otherwise, I'll leave that table up for you so you can have a look at it, and I will see you next time. Thanks again for watching.